Hello, everyone. Welcome to another sociology lecture. I am Dr. Dilsora Fozilova, and I'm going to discuss with you the writings of Frantz Fanon, specifically the one called The Wretched of the Earth. So I'm going through a few very important points Fanon makes in this writing. So Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth is a seminal work in postcolonial theory addressing the psychological, political, and social consequences of colonization and the necessity of decolonization. He makes very important points that sometimes when I think about Fanon's points, I actually think about some of the countries that going through or went through decolonization process, and it's just a very clear example of what Fanon is talking. One of the points Fanon makes in this writing is the violence as a tool for liberation. So because the colonization is based on violence, so Fanon argues that decolonization is inherently violent as well because colonialism itself built on violence. So he believes that the colonized must use violence to reclaim their humanity and freedom from oppressive colonial powers. This violence is not just physical, but also psychological, aimed at dismantling the colonial mindset. Therefore, he thinks because the colonial process was violent and colonialism built on violence, decolonization process also has to be violent. This is very the point. We can take a look at decolonization processes in many places in the world and see if that was actually right. If any countries decolonized without using any kind of bloodshed or violence, right? Like, I mean, violence doesn't mean bloodshed all the time. There's all different kinds of violence, right? But he's talking about, especially he's talking about violence ingrained in the colonization process and in the decolonization process. The second point Fanon makes is the psychological effects of colonialism. Fanon delves into a psychological trauma experienced by the colonized who are dehumanized and made to internalize a sense of inferiority. So they had to accept colonizer as somebody over them, like or better than them, and feel or internalize the sense of being a lower class, right? He shows how colonialism instills a colonial mentality that keeps the oppressed submissive. And after the countries decolonize, sometimes the people who were colonized before remain in that mindset. So that's what he's talking about. This leads to deep psychological scars that can only be healed through active resistance. And he gives us some idea about what resistance is, and he connects that to the idea of culture. And his next point is the role of national bourgeoisie. Actually, this is a critic of national elites or national bourgeoisie. When we say national bourgeoisie, after the decolonization of or after certain countries became independent, there were national bourgeois, which are the wealthiest or political elite or those people who are ruling the country developing similar mindsets as colonizers, that Fanon critiques them. He says that in his critique, he says the national bourgeoisie or the local elite emerges in a post-colonial societies. He argues that instead of serving the interests of the people, their own nationality, this class often collaborates with the former colonizers and continues exploitation, I can't even say the word today, exploitation of their own people. The people who are now elites, the political elites, or the wealthiest in the country, they lack revolutionary commitment, and in Fanon's view, become a barrier to true liberation and social justice. They continue that corruption, what the colonizers maybe inherited to them. Maybe they keep exploiting their own people, and they lack the sense of true liberation. And as someone from the country who that was colonized by Russia before. I was born in Uzbekistan. I can truly see that there was a struggle between new political elite and some of the opposition they had. So the opposition always criticized the political elite or wealthiest in the country for collaborating with colonizers and continuing their the authoritarian or dictatorial ruling in the country. So that's observable in many parts of the world today. The next point, Fanon makes the pitfalls of post-colonial nationalism. Fanon warns that post-colonial societies are often vulnerable to nationalism that mimics colonial structures, simply replacing foreign rulers or colonizers. Let's say they were from the other country, from British colonizers or Russian colonizers, right? They are simply replacing them with local elites. Actually, the local elites keep doing what exactly the colonizers did. Without a racial or radical changes in the country, the changes won't be happening in the economic sphere or social systems. These nations remain underdeveloped and neo-colonial, in his view, in nature. So because of this, the elite is remaining or replicating the colonial structures. They can't get out of that underdeveloped stage in their country and remain as neo-colonial because they still economically and socially kind of colonized by the colonizer, in other words. And 3 points, if we want to say that, they are replication of colonizers and mimics colonial structures that countries. They are vulnerable to nationalism. It was the same with what colonizers did. They were like, for example, Eurocentric. They were like the European nation or white nation is the best of the best, and the rest of the world is inferior, right? And they will stay underdeveloped. And also, the Fanon emphasizes that decolonization is not just a transfer of power from the colonizer to a national elite, but a total restructuring of society, including political, economic, and cultural dimensions. It involves reclaiming identity, culture, and autonomy that have been suppressed by colonial rule. So usually when the country is colonized, they um, they push their own culture, they push their own language, they push their own social systems, they push all these laws and regulations they have. So those main things internalized in the country, and it becomes part of that country. So therefore, Fanon is arguing that decolonization is a process of changing everything. Also, in his argument, he talks about rural peasantry and urban proletariat, which is like people who lived in the villages. They, for example, did agricultural stuff. Then people who lived in the cities and involved themselves with manufacturing and other stuff. He talks about that. He says peasants are less integrated to colonial system. The engagement in the revolutionary struggle for freedom, he says, peasants are more likely to fight for freedom than the proletariat. Somehow he is a little bit negative about people who worked with this colonial people, colonizers, and became some of them. He believes that the revolutionary potential lies with the rural peasantry rather than the urban proletariat. So the colonial contexts, peasants were less integrated into a colonial system and therefore more likely to engage in revolutionary struggle, in other words. So the next point he makes is the racism and dehumanization of the colonized. Fanon discusses how racism is both a tool and a consequences of colonialism. Racism dehumanizes the colonized and justifies their exploitation. So, like, for example, in certain parts of the world, laws did not allow the people of color to go to universities, for example, or they were, beside the law, they were inferior, right? So this racial hierarchy becomes internalized, perpetuating divisions and ensuring control over colonized populations. So, in other words, that dehumanized racial groups will keep that as psychological state and then feel very low. They don't have much trust in themselves or confidence in themselves. In his next point, he talks about the importance of culture in the decolonization process. For him, that reclaiming culture is essential to the decolonization process because that's what was ripped from the colonized people. Colonization not only stripped people of their land and resources, but also destroyed their cultural identity, tried to destroy their culture and religion and language and all of those things, which was very essential part of their identity. Reconnecting with native culture or their own culture becomes a form of resistance and the way of healing for the colonized people. Therefore, if you pay attention after independence in many countries, the reclaiming of language and culture and bringing back all this historical pieces together and rewriting their history books became like a form of how to fight with colonial system or colonizers, right? And this is the main point Fanon makes in this writing. The last thing is he calls for international solidarity. He says all these oppressed people should become together. He advocates for international solidarity among oppressed peoples across the globe. And he sees the struggle for liberation in colonized nations as part of a larger or global fight against imperialism or exploitation and oppression against these classes. So this is the main points of the Fanon mix in his writing. In summary, Fanon's Wretched of the Earth offers a powerful critique of colonialism and its lasting effects on the colonized. He emphasizes the necessity of violent revolution or violent fight against the colonizer, the psychological impact of colonialism, the dangers of postcolonial nationalism, and the need for radical, total transformation of society in the wake of decolonization. Just doing something is like, for example, declaring themselves independent is not enough. The countries has to be economically independent and they need to claim back their culture, language, and all these elements, as well as they have to be economically and socially independent from their colonizers. Um, Apologies, I just didn't turn off my Telegram and it started ringing. So that was my last point. Thank you for watching this video lecture, and I will talk to you soon again. Bye bye.